name is Filip. Some of you may remember me from the olden days when I was at Google in the Flutter team as a developer advocate. But now, since September, I'm at large. I have my own company, which is just me, and I am building games. And so this talk will be about games. I published a game last year, and it's called Knights of San Francisco. It is a little different than what you might expect from games, and I thought, hey, a lot of people are kind of like me, especially people who come to these DevFests. There are app developers, be it they do, Android SDK development, Flutter development, web development. They do apps, and maybe they don't know that they could use basically 90% of what they already know to, instead of building apps, build games. But before I jump into that, I want to say that I'm really honored and proud to be able to be part of this event, DevFest for Ukraine. And it's because I think Ukraine really needs our help against this invasion. And here in the Czech Republic, I think we understand this. We've had, albeit 50 years ago, we've had an invasion that is eerily similar to, in some respects, to the one that Ukraine is suffering right now. I thought you might like this. These are Czech fans on a hockey championship, and they were disallowed from showing a Ukrainian flag. So instead, they showed this. It's imagination. As I always say, your imagination is the best graphics card. Anyway, so that's really important for me, but let's get into the actual topic of this talk. So again, I want to talk about games if you are already a front-end or web or app developer of any kind. Some people have me associated with Flutter very strongly for good reason. I've been in the Flutter team for 5 years. I am still using Flutter. My game is in Flutter, but this is not about Flutter game development specifically. This is about understanding that some games are pretty good fit for you if you are already an app developer. App development turns out to be pretty close to some game development, and this is what I'm going to cover today. So if you're doing app development with the web, React, Angular, whatever is the cool new thing, if you're doing development in Swift UI, if you're doing development in Android SDK, if you're using Flutter as myself, all of these are really good frameworks and technologies for you to build your own game studio, basically. I like to say that games are basically in two categories. Video games, the more traditional video games, and app-like games. And that is not something that a gamer will know. Like, no gamer will say, hey, I'm going to play a app-like game today or something like this, or I want to buy an app-like game. But from the perspective of us, the developers, this makes a lot of sense to think about it that way, right? So video games are the more traditional ones where you have a joystick or a mouse and keyboard or a controller, and you continually apply some kind of input, and then the game itself will redraw every frame 60 times per second, 120 times per second, what have you, and will change basically all the pixels every frame. And then we have these app-like games. Since the beginning of games, we have had these games where instead of continually applying some input, you are basically using it as an app, but the app is there for entertainment, for fun. It doesn't, sometimes for learning, but it doesn't let you, I don't know, add to-do items to anything, but it simulates something cool. I like to give the example of a very successful indie game called Slay the Spire, which is, in the end, it doesn't look like an app, but you use it as an app. You have little things that you can click on. Maybe you can drag and drop a little bit. You have you see numbers, things change on the screen, but you can look at it as a game. So we have video games and app-like games. There you have it. Two categories, very useful for you as a game developer or budding game developer to think about, right? If you're thinking about game development, I'm pretty sure you're probably leaning towards the video games because, again, they are more traditional, they are often more cool and dynamic and stuff like this, right? But let me be blunt. You won't make the next Skyrim or Minecraft or Destiny or something like that. I'm sorry, but unless you have like $200 million in your pocket, that's not gonna happen. That ship has sailed. On the other hand, app-like games, you already know how to build apps. You can use the technology that you already know for this, right? If you fail, you still have learned a lot of lessons that you can then apply to app development, and you are not competing in app-like development. You're not competing against AAA titles of studios that are like literally, it's like competing against Hollywood, but you're competing against other people like you often. If you build one of those app-like games, you'll see that your audience is widening and your competition is narrowing, which is always a good thing. So app-like games really are even, it's not just easy mode as in like it's easy to build. It might not be easier to build, but it's easier to get out there and get some people to actually play your game, if not even pay for the game. Wow. So, all right, let's say you are sold and you're like, okay, how do I try this? Where do I start? So I say, first, understand that all games are simulations. You should probably, in my opinion, start with thinking about simulations and what you want to simulate. All games are simulations. Super Mario, a simulation. It is a simulation. It seems weird. It's obviously a simulation of something very, very not realistic, but it is a simulation. It has physics in it. It has AI or agents that do something. It has rules, and there's a running simulation there that you can interact with and play. So is Pac-Man, so is Pong, but so is also obviously all the other games that are out there. So your job is to come up with something to simulate that is interesting. Now, the next question after you know what you want to simulate is, can you simulate it as an app-like game? This could be hard, right? Because the mind immediately jumps to, to video games. For example, let's say you're really into football. I mean soccer, but it's probably the same even if we would be talking about American football. Anyway, you're into football. The easiest thing to think about if you're trying to build a football game is a video game where you have a joystick and your controller, and then you play football in real time, right? But that's one way of making football into a computer game. But another one is to have something like Football Manager, where you're like, okay, I'm a manager of a football team. I buy footballers or people who play football players, and I can change tactics and do all that stuff, right? One of my favorite games from when I was a little kid was called Footballer of the Year, which was basically on a lower level. You were a football player, but you didn't just run around the playing field. Instead, it was basically like you were given cards, which were like, oh, you have a chance to play a goal, and you could, if I remember correctly, it was something like that. It was an app-like game basically, with little mini games sprinkled into it. But most of the thing was just an app-like game, and it was really fascinating to me. And I played it way more than the traditional football games, because it was just like I was able. The simulation was more interesting to me, because it was like going from some kid that can play football into some kid on in a championship or world championship player, and getting better along the way, and so on and so forth. So even then, and even in something like football, you can have an app-like game. So now you have an idea and you have a technology. Again, you can be, if you're an Android SDK developer, just use Android SDK to build your app-like game, because that's what you're doing anyway. Don't try to like overanalyze it. Just do what you already know, and it'll work out. One other thing I want to warn you against is daydreaming too much. If you are new into a new game, you will have the urge to dream about that game and be like, oh, that would be cool if my game could do this and that. And you will do it anyway, but try to resist it as much as possible, and instead of that daydreaming, build the actual game. You'll see how it's much easier, and it's very tempting to come up with new ideas and new features for the game, and then your idea goes way beyond where you are currently in reality, and then it almost seems like, why am I even working on this? It's more fun to daydream than to build the game. Finishing is a skill. And this is especially true in game development. Finishing is not something that just happens. You have to learn how to finish stuff, how to drive them to completeness, right? If you're employed, someone else is probably driving you to complete what you're doing, and so you don't need to think about it. But if you're a solo game developer, you have to learn how to finish, how to stop improving, and how to stop thinking about stuff, but how to actually finish. Finishing is often not fun. I said before, game development is fun, especially at first, but at some point, any kind of development comes to a point where things are actually pretty boring and pretty frustrating, and you have to go through that phase, and you have to actually finish. When I started with game development, I wasn't doing this at all, and I would often start a project, and then I would play around with it, and then I would spend a significant amount of time on doing it, and then another project would come by, or another idea, or I would just get bored with this one, and I would just bend on it, and then I would never come back to it, right? And that's, to me, you could always say like, oh, but I learned so much, blah, blah, blah. But you still threw away a lot of time. And now you're doing it again and again and again. So, okay, I'm talking about how you, an app developer or a front-end developer, can become a indie game developer, basically. Right? So what are the differences? Obviously, games are not, even app-like games are not the same as apps, right? So what are the differences? The first and most important thing I want to say is that games are cultural artifacts. They, when you compare it with apps, games are there to give you some emotions often. They have music in them, they have art, they are more culture than what most apps are, right? And so you have to think about them this way. You're basically sculpting something. You're not making an order of an app. there's a form of self-expression in game development. One obvious change is that games have more custom design, more interesting design often, right? They don't need to be all like all the colors, and they don't need to all look like Candy Crush, basically. And on the other hand, they don't all need to look like edgy, 13-year-old boy dark dungeons. You can make games that are very weird, and the design can be very different, but they still often as like they would be very weird apps, because apps generally try to kind of stay away from having too much of an opinion on design and on aesthetics. For example, if you have a game where the player is a spaceship captain, and she is able to shoot photon torpedoes on other spaceships, then probably the icon or the button that lets the player launch a torpedo should not just be the regular button that you will find in a normal app. It could be for like a beta version or something like this, or very early alpha, I mean. But at some point, you need to make the button cool in some ways, and it needs to be satisfying to be like, pew, So it probably needs sound. It probably needs some effect. It probably needs to look differently than a default button. Similarly, the app itself should be more in motion. It should feel more alive, right? So if you have an app like a to-do app, it's very common and probably desirable that if you're not doing anything to a to-do app, that to-do app will just be static. It would just like look at you the same way you look at it, and there would be no motion there, right? But for games, you often want to add just a little bit of motion to that, and it's with modern frameworks like Flutter or other. It's pretty easy to be like, you know what, I want this to be a normal list view or whatever, but at the background I want something to slowly rotate or slowly go out of focus or something like this, right? And that alone will make the app or game look more like a game and less like an app. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, that's interesting. Basically what game development with app-like games is exercising my UI development muscles a lot. And that's also my point. That's exactly it. There's nothing comes out of your experience with game development, you will become a better UI developer because you will be forced to do all these little things. Become a game developer to become a better app developer is what I'm saying. So now, like, what do you do? What's the schedule, or what do you do first and next? And to me, it's pretty easy. Come up with an idea or more ideas. Pick one. Start implementing it. Don't daydream too much, and get to a playable thing as soon as possible. And before you're happy with it, long before you're happy with it, give it to other players to try. I can guarantee you that by the time you have anything that is even resembling a game, you will not have the ability to see if this is fun or not. As always, quality in games comes from iteration. As much as possible, if you can put something out there, try it, change it, and do it again, all over again and again, that makes good games. If you don't trust me, I have a favorite book that I have read now, I think 2 times, by Tynan Sylvester, who is the author of RimWorld. Maybe you know that game. Also, in my opinion, an app-like game, by the way. But anyway, Tynan Sylvester made a book called Designing Games, and I think his most powerful thesis in that whole book is how it's really important to iterate and how it's really important to not write this like design document of like what the game should look like and have something in your mind, but instead to have something out there and test it with actual people and playtest until you have something that's really cool. Now, let's say you have a really good core of the gameplay that people really enjoy and you think is working, then it's time to start finishing. And finishing a game is pretty painful and not very fun. But unless you want this as just a hobby, then you need to learn how to do it. And finishing means, okay, you need to add music, you need to add all the little things like main menu and stuff like this. You need to figure out what the pricing is going to be, if there's going to be pricing. You need to add the levels, the content, because it's unless it's like a little web game, it needs a lot of content for people to be happy with for at least 90 minutes, right? But often a lot of people and a lot of genres, you have to keep people happy for tens of hours, which is hard. This is also something I want to touch on. I should have mentioned in the beginning of the talk is you have a choice, right? You can build games, you can become a game developer as a hobby, as just something that you do in your spare time, and you don't really want to release anything ever, or you want to do it as something that you like, still a hobby maybe, but something that where you want to release. Like you have a drive to actually become a published game developer. I would argue that you probably want the latter. You want to be able to publish something, because it's more painful. You will learn a lot more from this than from just playing around with code. And also it's more satisfying, let's be honest, to be able to say I finished and published a game than to say, yeah, I spent the last many weekends to work on this, but now it's in the phase of like I'm not really sure if I want to work on it anymore, so I'll probably come up with another project. It could work if you really enjoy this kind of stuff, programming, but I don't know. I think it's better to drive for actual publishing. All right, at the beginning I said that this talk is for not just for Flutter developers, but for developers of any app framework. But I'll say that if you happen to be a Flutter developer, I have a talk, a 1 hour long talk on the Flutter channel where I explain exactly like the technical details of how you could build your own game. There's also this flutter.dev/games where you have other resources that you can use. All right, I hope I persuaded a few of you to actually try and become a solo indie game developer, and that you will have fun and success. Even if not, at least fun, and at least you'll learn a few things along the way, which you can then use for your normal career. In any case, have fun.